Hello, I'm David Healy. I'm a professor of psychiatry, and I'm interested in clinical trials and the drugs we take that get put through clinical trials to try and prove they work. And this talk is going to focus in on the increasing vogue to get women who are pregnant involved in clinical trials, and it's going to center on vaccines that have recently been approved for respiratory syncytial virus. This is an illness that can affect young children. And my colleague here, whom you see, Peter Celi, is the person who's done all the work you're going to hear about on the vaccine. My contribution to this talk is the frame, which you're going to get first before his work and then after his work, which tells you a bit more about what you might call the ethics of clinical trials, or you could call the marketing, or it's hard to tell actually the difference these days between ethics and marketing. Right, let me move forward. And my first introduction to the issues that you're going to hear about came when I was asked to write with Dee Mangan. I was asked to write a chapter for this book you see here. And it was a book that was being edited by two bioethicists that I like a lot and think very highly of. And when the overture came to write the chapter, I thought, this is going to be a book that's going to be critical and focus on the issues in a hard-hitting way. And Dee and I wrote a chapter, which I like the title of, which is, Does My Bias Look Big in This? And to my surprise, however, the book took a completely different line. It was mostly in favor of women getting involved in clinical trials when they were pregnant, and it didn't seem to be seeing that there could be any kind of problem here. This is a little bit of a mystery for me, but the mystery has deepened since we had the COVID pandemic, because I've been involved with a bunch of lawyers, tough hombres who've taken on the pharmaceutical industry on a range of drugs like the SSRIs and other drugs, and they knew that industry get up to a whole load of dodgy tricks and things like that. But to my surprise, talking to them about the vaccine trials done by the same companies, they figured the companies were going to have played it straight when it came to the vaccines. And I guess bioethicists feel like when it comes to pregnancy, that companies are going to play it straight as well. And I'm the odd person out who somehow thinks that leopards don't change their spots. So here for me is the key slide in this talk. And this is the Oval Office on October the 10th, 1962, when John Kennedy has just signed a new Food and Drugs Act. And this is following the thalidomide crisis, which is about drugs in pregnancy causing problems. And the hope is that we're going to make sure that these things don't happen again. And in a very gallant way, he's reaching over and handing the pen that he's just signed the act with to Frances Kelsey, who's the only woman in the room, as you see. Now, there's two interesting points about this. First of all, the 1962 Act is replacing the 1938 Act. And the 1938 Act was all about our safety on drugs. The 1962 Act isn't about our safety on drugs. It's about, do drugs and vaccines work? And regulation across the board, from food to traffic to the stock market, is really all about keeping us safe. Medicines are the only thing I can think of where it's the focus is on, do these drugs work? And the curious thing about it is prescription drugs are among the most unsafe things we have. They're inherently risky in a way that food isn't, for the most part. And the other thing about the Act was it's replacing the judgment of people, in this case, a woman who is the person who held up the licensing of this drug. It's replacing her judgment with the judgment of an algorithm. Now, let's move on and see what we think about all this. This is the next slide that's of interest to me. And this shows, at a time when women don't take soft cheeses, they don't take processed meats, they don't drink coffee when they're pregnant, they don't smoke when they're pregnant, they don't drink alcohol, they're warned not to drink alcohol. And you'd have thought they wouldn't be taking drugs either following thalidomide. You see that from the 1970s onwards, there's a steady march upwards. And I'm sure the graph has gone much higher, but we don't have the latest figures. But part of the interesting thing here is that this is being led by well-educated, white, liberal, middle-class women. This isn't poor people taking all these drugs. They're the ones who are not taking the drugs. And one of the interesting things here is, we've got adverts when you go out for a meal, which say, don't drink alcohol if you're pregnant. But one of the drugs that's been taken the most are the SSRI group of drugs, which can cause women to compulsively drink even when they're pregnant and raise the risk of fetal alcohol syndrome tenfold. But there are no warnings there about, beside the alcohol warning to say, well, maybe you shouldn't take SSRIs while you're pregnant either. So I've told you about my bioethical colleagues, and I got a little bit more insight on where they were coming from this US government volume, which is all about trying to increase diversity. And the pharmaceutical industry and the US government are married on this one. They want to make sure that people of color and people of different ethnic groups and pregnant women and all sorts of people get involved in clinical trials. And the arguments are awfully reasonable. They're saying pregnant women aren't vulnerable. And of course they aren't. They aren't vulnerable people. And the other thing that, the chapters say is that when you're pregnant, this is a time when women need the best possible evidence. And randomized controlled trials are the best evidence. And for a woman who's pregnant to be thinking about taking a pill and ask a doctor, well, what's the evidence that this works and is going to be safe? And for him or her not to be able to answer the question is just unreasonable. And the only way to get around that is to do clinical trials in women who are pregnant. Now, I'm not going to dwell on this, but this is Bill Gates, who's heavily involved in the issue of developing vaccines, among other things, for respiratory syncytial virus, and also the issue about ensuring that clinical trials get done in women who are pregnant. And here's some of his contributions towards the development of RSV vaccines. It's a huge amount of money. Now, there's no problem with this. This is not an anti-Bill Gates talk, but you'll see there's a theme that does come through. One of the things that's interesting about respiratory syncytial virus and vaccines for it is back in the 1960s, the first RSV vaccine was developed and put into clinical trials in people who are ethnically diverse and poor, as it turned out. And this is part of the reason maybe why people from those backgrounds are slow to get involved, are slow to be encouraged to get involved in some of the clinical trials we do. And this brought to light a phenomenon we didn't know about, which is the children who got the vaccine were more likely to die from RSV. It looked like having the vaccine somehow made a respiratory disease worse if you caught it. And this is a new phenomenon called vaccine-associated enhancement of respiratory disease. And this is the thing that's haunted the field of respiratory vaccines ever since. And all of the talk about the RSV vaccines, one of which has just been approved yesterday or 2 days ago, was that we finally cracked this problem. That's at least what they're actually saying to us. Now, let me just pick up some consent issues here. This is an article I wrote 25 years ago, which said, we need to think twice before any of us, not just pregnant women, are involved in company trials, because companies are in the business of saying our drugs have no problem, or don't cause any problems at all, and they use their clinical trials to make that claim. They're able to hide any of the problems that happen in clinical trials simply by virtue of focusing on the one thing they want the trial to show. So elephants can walk through the room and the people running the trials are going to miss it. And this is Ian Hudson, who works for GlaxoSmithKline, who is making this claim under oath in a legal case for a man called Don Shell, had been put on GSK's Paxil, and 48 hours later shot his wife and his daughter and his granddaughter and himself. And the jury figured that Hudson's ideas about clinical trials showing us what drugs really do was just wrong. The interesting thing about Hudson is he later became the CEO of the British Drugs Regulator. So this kind of thinking is ensconced to the top of EMA and FDA and things like that. And he now, since he stepped down from the MHRA, he now works for the Bill and Melinda Gates Foundation. Now, this is a more recent article, which has just come out this year, which is looking at the consent form you sign if you're getting involved in a company trial. And I know two people, Augusto Roux and Brianne Dressen, who've been involved in 2 of the COVID vaccine trials and been seriously injured in those trials. Now, when they got involved in the trial, they had to sign a consent form. And the consent form said, look, if you're injured at all in our trial, we're going to give you the best possible medical care you could conceivably get. Here's the number of our, this is what they've been told by companies like Pfizer. Here's the number of our insurance policy for this trial. Here's the phone number of the investigator where you live. If you've got any concerns, just call him up and he will help sort things out for you. Well, that's not what happened for either Augusto or Brie or anyone who gets injured in company trials. You don't get compensated. The company doesn't recognize that you've been injured by their vaccine. You don't get treatment, and it's an issue. The man you see in the middle here is Mark Barnes, and that's a lawyer who works for Ropes and Gray. And several years ago, 13, 14 years ago, Pfizer were fined over $2 billion by the Department of Justice in the United States, and for misleading doctors about the hazards that can be linked to the drugs the company had. And in the wake of that, Barnes and others set up a thing called multi-regional clinical trials, which was a version of all trials, which GSK set up a few years later when they were fined $3 billion by the Department of Justice. Barnes is the eminence grise is maybe the wrong word. He's awfully impressive. He thinks things through and develops strategies. In the case of vaccines, he's been able to persuade WHO to issue instructions to people who are doing research on vaccines to tell them you should never link an adverse event that appears to happen in the clinical trial that you're investigating to the vaccine. It's straight up front in black and white print. So this is an interesting situation. Now, things are awfully tricky for those of us who can get involved in trials and for doctors and academics who do the research and things like that, in that none of us can get access to the clinical trial data from the company trial. They just refuse to hand it over. The authors on articles that get written about the trial haven't seen the data, and in fact, they don't write the articles either. It's a slightly different story when it comes to investors in the company, where almost 15 years ago, the Supreme Court in the United States decided that investors who are investing their money in a company have the right to see the raw data and to make up their own mind about what this data shows, which is a very different position to the position you and I are in. Now, when it comes to the trial, the Pfizer's respiratory syncytial vaccine trial, here's part of the consent form. Now, first of all, let me point out the word Advara on the right-hand side. In Europe and places like that, we've got ethics committees that companies have to take their clinical trial protocol through and get approved. And in the United States, it used to be institutional review boards, and there used to be hundreds of them linked to each hospital and each university. They've all collapsed down now and are run by 2 or 3 big companies, of which Advara is one. And these are a prime investment vehicle because they often write the trial protocols and they approve the protocol that they've just written. And it's all tricky stuff. But if you look at the informed consent form here, just down at the end, it says the risks associated with the study vaccine may be experienced by you, but not your baby, because the baby is not getting the vaccine. You are. Now, does that make sense? we're going to go on now to Pfizer's and GSK's respiratory syncytial vaccine trials, and you'll see why the details kind of cast doubt on this as well. But overall, we've got a situation where the climate at the moment is producing a situation where, where women were awfully slow to get involved, well, to have vaccines while pregnant, and certainly to get involved in research. That's all changed. You're now a super mom if you decide to get involved in a vaccine trial, and you certainly should be having every single vaccine that you get offered while pregnant. So here's Pfizer's RSV maternal vaccine, and this is the Matisse trial. Before going into the details of this, and this is where Peter's work comes into play, I'm going to tell you quickly about GSK's pediatric trial. And this is a trial where, as opposed to giving the vaccine to pregnant women, the idea was to give the vaccine to infants who are about a year old and monitor them from being a year old to 2 years old to see did they get RSV. And this is an NHS ethics committee, where we still have ethics committees over in the UK, saying that they weren't going to approve the trial, because the trial was focused very heavily not on do the children get RSV, but does the vaccine produce antibodies? And this is one of the links to the COVID story, where the claims were the COVID vaccines work because they produce antibodies. Well, that's not necessarily clear, particularly for respiratory viruses. The issue is, does the person get the infection? Do they obviously get it or not? So this trial did go ahead. It didn't go ahead in the UK because it got turned down, but it also didn't publish. Something odd has happened, and the trial began years ago and remains unpublished. GSK also had a maternal vaccine. This is for women who get pregnant, and you're approached and you get involved. And this is a big trial. This was 10,000 people, and all of a sudden it disappeared off the radar. There had been a bunch of things saying the trial's going wonderfully well, etc., and then there was radio silence about 2 years ago. Well, just over a year ago, and Peter, my colleague, wrote to GSK and said, look, what's going on with your trial? And there was no reply. So he wrote to the regulator in the UK and asked them what's going on with GSK's trial. And he was told that it had been paused, that there was an issue of prematurity. Now, this was months later. It turns out that it had been paused, well, actually stopped on the 28th of February. And GSK, this says for media, but it was really investors. They briefed their investors shortly after the trial had been halted, within a week or two. The investors knew what was going on. The regulators didn't apparently know what was going on, and the rest of us certainly didn't know what was going on, even when we asked. And here's a little bit about what's going on. What you see there is on at the top line of this table, there's the number of preterm births. Now, there were more people going on the vaccine than on the placebo, so you have to take that into account. But there's still a considerable excess of people having a preterm birth on the vaccine. But more to the point, look at the next line after it. Neonatal deaths, these were significantly increased, okay, doubled. So this is not just a preterm birth issue, which for men may sound reasonably harmless. It's not, but neonatal deaths is certainly not harmless. And GSK were awfully puzzled about this, and they said, we don't know what's going on, we can't explain it. They worked on the data for you. Part of the reason we didn't hear about it was their view was, well, until they knew what was going on, they didn't really want to talk about the trial. And they've looked through it and things like that. Now, you don't need to read all this. It's just here as a prompt to me. In a talk in which this slide featured, they said, well, look, you don't need to worry about it. It didn't happen in high-income countries. It was just low and middle-income countries. And one of the things we seem to notice is it seemed to happen more often in women who had had another vaccine while pregnant. And this trial was being done while COVID was happening and the COVID vaccines were being rolled out. They didn't say the COVID vaccines were causing the problem, but there was a hint that maybe this is the way to explain their data, which brings me on to this. Everybody knows, I think, when the COVID vaccine trials were run, they excluded pregnant women and men who were likely to get their wives pregnant were also excluded. The whole issue about pregnancy was left out of the frame completely. And people, including women, said, you know, really, there should be a trial done in pregnant women also. And Pfizer finally were talked into it, and they began a trial that was going to recruit 4,000 women, but gave up with less than 400 participants recruited. The word they put out, which bioethicists I've heard talk about, have said, well, you know, everybody had been vaccinated at that point, so they really couldn't find pregnant women to recruit to the trial. You can believe that if you want. I don't think it's likely. But the other thing is, Pfizer said, look, we'll keep a pregnancy registry. And when asked for that, they haven't handed it over. So, you know, I don't know what's going on. You don't know what's going on, but it's not hugely encouraging. Now, this is Pfizer's respiratory syncytial virus trial, and there's usually phase 2 trials to try and get the dose right and to see just what's going on, and then a bigger phase 3 trial, which is what they give to FDA to get the vaccine or the drug licensed. And this is the phase 2 trial, which was appearing around the time that GSK had halted theirs. And this is why Peter began to wonder, you know, did this trial and the GSK trial show similar problems? And I've put up a weather vane on the right-hand side there, because with the vaccine trials, including the COVID vaccine trials, you know, what you get is articles which look like the final product here in the New England Journal of Medicine, but they're actually interim. You know, they report after the first phase of the trial is over, but the trial's ongoing and they need to follow up people for ages. So if you look at this article, thinking it's the final article and says, look, it looks like there's a problem here, you know, the company can almost say, well, I mean, it's almost as though they've put a finger up and tested which way the wind is blowing. And somehow the next set of results that have come in somehow seem to make the problem that you've been worried about in this paper disappear. So what was the problem that Peter was worried about in this paper? And the answer is here: prematurity, which is, and the article says, you know, there were 15 premature births in this trial. Now, there were more people taking the vaccine rather than the placebo. But, you know, what it didn't say, which you'd have thought it should have said, was that 14 of the 15 were on the vaccine. You know, there was a definite increase in risk. And if you look, I mean, it's a bit small print, but if you look down at the table, the sort of third column, the third row down is neonatal jaundice. And that's increased. Now, when babies are born premature, they tend to be jaundiced. So this is not a big surprise. The two go hand in hand. What is a little bit of a surprise here is you've not seen the full table, and there was lots more neonatal jaundice than you see here. So Peter wrote to the New England Journal of Medicine and said, look, you know, it's great to see that this vaccine looks like it might work. And you've said there's no obvious evident issues as regards to the safety and things like that. But, you know, I've been looking at the appendices that you have to the article, and there does seem to be a lot more jaundice going on, 7-fold more. You know, what on earth's going on? Is there a signal here about things that we should be worried about? Now, one of the overlaps between the RSV trials and the COVID trials is the New England Journal of Medicine simply do not report any adverse events that happened in any of these trials. There may be a table like the one you've seen, but if you write in and say, look, it looks like there could be an issue here, the New England Journal of Medicine simply don't publish the letter. It's you know, they just, it's a bit like, if you get in touch about an adverse event, they hold up the garlic and the crucifix, basically. What they did was they sent a letter to Pfizer, who responded late, about 3 or 4 months later, and said something very curious, which is, half of infants have neonatal jaundice. Well, they may if you sort of just check their bilirubin level, but it's not the case that half of the infants that get born are jaundiced at birth. It's just not the case. They're saying that because we didn't observe 50% of the kids in this trial being jaundiced, then obviously people weren't looking for this, so you can't rely on the measurements. And the other thing they said, the other defense was that, well, we didn't give the vaccine to the child, so there's no reason to think that the vaccine could have caused this problem in the infant. Well, no, there isn't, but being born prematurely could cause it. So, it's splitting hairs here. And here's the notional first author on that paper. Like all clinical trials these days, it's almost certainly a ghostwritten article, and this man didn't see the data and didn't write the article, I'm sure. The reason to show the slide is he was on the Data Safety Monitoring Board for GSK's vaccine trial that stopped, and he knows that their vaccine for RSV, which is almost identical to the Pfizer one, was stopped because of prematurity and neonatal death. But yet he's got his name on this article. He's the first author, notional author, where there does seem to be a prematurity issue, and it's all being downplayed. When I say it's been downplayed, like GSK reporting the problems first to their investors, here's Pfizer reporting the trial, saying to their investors that it's going wonderfully well. There's no problem with our trial. It's great, wonderful, marvelous. And the person who was very awkward asking GSK questions about the prematurity issue was on this call as well. He's a guy called Stephen Scala, who was asking Pfizer, saying, there was prematurity issues in the GSK vaccine, which is identical to yours almost. Is there an issue with your vaccine? And William Gruber, who's one of the authors on the article you've just seen, and is a senior honcho in Pfizer, says absolutely not. We know GSK had problems, but there was no problem with our vaccine. So I told you there was a phase 2 trial, and then there's a phase 3 trial, which is the same weather vane type trial. You see at first blush what you think is the final article in the New England Journal of Medicine, and you get told afterwards, no, the trial's ongoing. So the concern you had, well, new data has come in and it's not a concern anymore. But anyway, we're going to deal with the data in this article. And the first author there is Beatty Kampmann, and you're going to be hearing her name. And this trial ended early, but not because there was a disaster. It ended early, notionally at least, because the vaccine worked so well. It was 82% effective. Okay, and here's the results, but you're not going to be able to read this, but you can see roughly just there at the top. Maybe you can see there was 3,600 roughly people on the vaccine and 3,600 roughly taking the placebo. And there were 6 infants of the women in the vaccine group who got RSV afterwards, and 33 infants in the placebo group. And this is where the 82% effectiveness comes from. And here's Beatty saying, this is great. The vaccine worked wonderfully well and is completely safe. And here she is talking in Lisbon recently, and she's saying there was no statistically significant difference in the levels of prematurity between the vaccine and the placebo arm. When you see a phrase like this, let me translate it. It means there was more prematurity on the vaccine than on the placebo. She's also saying, the levels of prematurity in this trial were pretty low. It's much higher in normal clinical practice. So if you're involved in research, you get good clinical care and looked after better, and it's much less likely that you're going to have a premature baby. What she doesn't tell you is to get recruited into the trial, you cannot ever have had any pregnancy complications before, and certainly not prematurity. So, as regards the risks for prematurity, they were really recruiting the healthiest possible bunch of women. And here's a slide Beatty had in her slide deck when she was giving that talk, and she didn't show it. Now, you'd wonder why she didn't show it, because everything looks pretty harmless there. You know, it doesn't look like there's anything screaming at you. There's an awful problem with the vaccine compared to the placebo. There's a trick in that, which is called the y-axis trick. You see, the scale goes from 0 to 100, and that makes all of these bars look tiny. But if you had the scale going from maybe 0 to 20, then all of those bars would look much taller and perhaps a little more alarming. The other trick is that she's quoting percentages and not figures. So ideally, to make Pfizer look worse, I should shrink the y-axis down to 20 or 30 or whatever. I'm not going to do that. I'm going to increase it up to 250, which should be good for Pfizer. But I'm going to convert the percentages into figures. And here's what the graph now looks like. And you see that, you know, the blue bars for prematurity, the two sets of bars on the left-hand side, do point towards a worrying problem, particularly extreme prematurity, where the risk is doubled. That's under 34 weeks. And how well did the vaccine work? Well, you're told that there were 6 cases of RSV on the vaccine, but here's an appendix that didn't come with the paper, but is there. And you find that, well, actually, they're not quoting 6. At 90 days, which is the point Beattie had been quoting in the article, there were 10 here in this appendix. And she said there were 33 on placebo, and this table just gives you 31. And that makes the vaccine efficacy 68%. And if you look after, you know, from 3 months on to 6 months and on further, you find the vaccine efficacy falls off a lot. By a year, it's down to 33%. The other point to note is 31 of 3,480 means it's less than 1% of the children getting RSV. And if the vaccine's 67% effective, the absolute, you've got a less than 1% chance that your infant's going to get RSV. And giving the vaccine is only going to reduce the risk by less than 0.5%. So, 82% efficacy sounds great, but if you look at what's actually happening to kids, then it's a bit different. And if you look at the respiratory infections, that kids get during the first year of life, does the vaccine in helping RSV, does it overall mean that the kid's going to have less respiratory infections? Well, no, vaccine efficacy, 7%, that's nothing to write home about. And here's another problem with the trial. When you signed the consent form telling you that this couldn't possibly injure your child, it's only going to be harmful to you at best, you get paid for visits to the trial center. And one of the bunch of visits that you can make if you're a woman who's had the vaccine and had a reaction to the vaccine, well, you may be feeling bad or grotty and you want to know, is it okay? And you go along, to consult and get paid for it. And you may well get told, yeah, this looks like you've had the active vaccine. But, that's the bad news. But the good news is your child's not going to get RSV. And in terms of bringing your infant along after he or she is born, then, if you're worried that your child might have RSV and you haven't been along for your visit because you got placebo and didn't feel a thing, if you bring the child along worried that they may have RSV, well, you get paid for bringing them along there as well. So, this all makes you wonder about what was going on and how dependable the results are. As I say, they're only minor. And this is the other aspect to it, which is the infant can be harmed, but so too can the mother. And just look at the very top line. Women were more likely, there was a third more likely to have a significant adverse event on the vaccine than on placebo. And if you look at the pregnancy issues, it's almost double. That's the third bold line down. It's almost double the rate of significant adverse events in the mothers. And if you look at the very bottom line, the most serious adverse event usually that happens in pregnancy is a condition called eclampsia. And that's more than doubled in these women. This is the kind of thing that can cause premature birth and neonatal deaths and other problems. And it's one of the big mysteries. We don't know what actually causes it. We can't usually treat it all that well. So this all raises a certain amount of doubt about the newspaper coverage about what was going on. 82% effective was trumpeted, and just a few days ago, FDA approved this vaccine, partly because, well, we don't really need it in the United States, where if you breastfeed, then your child's not going to get RSV. But low and middle income countries are not going to take the vaccine unless it's been approved in the United States. So this is part of the argument why FDA felt they needed to approve it. Here's another little issue that's a curiosity. And this is a Danish group, and there's been more than one group reporting this, which is, you look at RSV through the COVID pandemic, when we locked down and wore masks and kids didn't go to school and this, that, and the other. And one of the good things was they didn't get RSV during the first year or two of life. They got it in year 3 or 4. And it turns out when you get it in year 3 and 4, on average, it's more severe than if you get it during year 1. And this is possibly the polio story, which was if you get polio in year 1, there's no problem. If you get polio when you're 3 or 4, there are serious problems. So, I'm not saying this is what's happening. I'm just wondering how much we know about what we're doing. Right. Here's an article in the Lancet which cites marketing copy. It was written for marketers. It's not an academic article, saying 33 million kids get RSV each year and several million end up in hospital and tens of thousands die. Now, that's repeated again and again in this and a range of other articles. It's a global figure. If you look at the rates in the Western world, if you look at Europe, the death rates from RSV in kids in Europe, in most countries in Europe, are too low to calculate. But that's not the reason why I'm showing you this. I'm showing you this for page 2 and 3 of this article. And halfway down column 1 on page 2, the authorship line of this article starts. And it goes all the way through column 2 and over onto page 3, and you will never have seen an authorship line as long as this. And while the vaccines, we're told the whole time, are aimed at low and middle income countries, most of the academics and the doctors here are from high income countries. But you've got a very large group of opinion leaders who are going to push the vaccine and say people really need to get it. And here's another Lancet article making the same marketing copy points. Why would an academic journal do this? Well, they're probably paid a lot. This is a cash cow for them. But it's again the authorship line that I want you to look at, which is huge. And this happens again and again and again for RSV. And the push, there's a marketing push here long before approval. And this is ResVNet. This is kind of site that's been set up a few years ago to tell people about RSV. And again, you've got the 33 million deaths and 3 million kids going to hospital. It's the same marketing copy. But the interesting thing about it, well, there's a few interesting things about ResVNet. This replicates the dashboards we had for COVID, which spread a great deal of fear. You saw the dashboard, how many people were actually getting infected and going into hospital and dying. Whether we can believe all these or not, it's a different thing. It's like getting on a weighing scales and seeing that your weight is a bit higher than it should be and getting all worked up and figuring that you need to stop eating for a month or two. And RSV comes in seasons. I've picked out France here. So if you're French and you go into the dashboard, they show you what the data looks like for RSV last year, what it looks like just now, which I'm sure will be quite low. And again, as we get to a build-up, you'll have the RSV season showing peaks, kids getting RSV and kids ending up in hospital and things like that, and it generates pressure. Now, this isn't sponsored by Pfizer or GSK. It's sponsored by AstraZeneca. And the story here is interesting, which is there's not just vaccines, there's also monoclonal antibodies. And you see the button there to press to get the video to tell you all about RSV. This features in the New England Journal of Medicine along with the academic articles. And the story, the background story is there was a fairly decent monoclonal antibody called palivizumab, which we've had for over a decade, which doctors sometimes gave to infants who were born immune compromised or serious other illnesses, where you figured you did not want them to get RSV. It would just be risky. Now, in the ordinary course of events, you would not give a monoclonal antibody to anyone if you can avoid it, and certainly not infants. They can be awfully effective, but they come with terrific problems. So it's risky business, and you need to know what you're doing. Makes a bit of sense if the kid is very compromised. Palivizumab was coming to the end of its patent life, and AstraZeneca bought it and the company that owned it, and are replacing it with the just approved nirsevimab, which is just the same, but costs a lot more. And there's going to be a push to give it to every child that's born near the RSV season. So here's something else just on that score, the push, which is this is the House of Lords in the United Kingdom. The kind of proceedings are recorded by a thing called Hansard. And you've got three ladies in the House of Lords who on a few occasions, not just the one you see here, have asked the government questions. The health minister gets called to the House of Lords while the ladies ask him, what has been done about the forthcoming RSV season? Are we going to have our monoclonal antibodies? Are we going to have our vaccines? Tell us what's going on. And the minister says, well, yes, of course, we're trying our best, and we're certainly going to have the monoclonal antibodies. And now that the Pfizer vaccine is approved by FDA, I'm sure he'll be saying that. Now, I'm going to take a little bit of Celtic liberty here. If you're female and Celtic, you are a girl up to the age of 90. If you're female and Anglo-Saxon, you're a woman after the age of 14. So I'm wondering what the girls who've been asking the question here are going to do about this. Let me show you if I can.
There's something out there. It's a highly contagious disease. It can be especially serious, even fatal to infants. Unfortunately, many people who spread it may not know they have it. It's called whooping cough, and the CDC recommends everyone, including those around babies, make sure their whooping cough vaccination is up to date. Understand the danger your new grandchild faces. Talk to your doctor or pharmacist about you and your family getting a whooping cough vaccination today.
So that was GSK and the pertussis vaccine, and I know friends in the United States who can't visit their sister's child because they haven't had the vaccine. So GSK will likely run a similar advert for an RSV vaccine, as will Pfizer. GSK's RSV vaccine for children hasn't been approved, but it has for adults over the age of 60. And this is Magic Johnson, who's the front man for the GSK vaccine. Pfizer's has also been approved, even though it causes Guillain-Barré syndrome. So you're told if you're an older person that, your life can be cut short. Lots of older people die from RSV, people like me. That may well be true, but the pressure is going to come from your children are going to be told that if they have a child, they shouldn't let you visit unless you've had your RSV vaccine. So there's a huge overlap in lots of ways between the COVID vaccines and the RSV vaccines. You've got Bill and Albert over there on the left-hand side. And, my point here is a different one to what you may think. I don't have a conflict of interest issue with Bill's money and all this. I don't mind that the vaccine gets produced by Pfizer. That's not a big deal. The articles are all ghost-written. Up on top there, you've got the lady that wrote the Pfizer vaccine trials. I'm not exactly sure who wrote the RSV vaccine trials. This is at the COVID vaccines. The editor for the New England Journal of Medicine is there, Eric Rubin, who, as I said, just simply will not entertain that any of these vaccines could have caused any harms whatsoever. Where there's convincing evidence, but I've examined the patients and got in touch and said, look, here are these injuries and you're the report of your trial hasn't mentioned them. What are you going to do? Eric, in essence, says, get lost. And his view about giving the COVID vaccines to children was, who cares about the science? You know, if we're going to work out, do these vaccines work? You know, we've got to just give them to children, basically, which is what he's saying over there on the left. And, you know, so the articles are ghost written, there's no access to the data. You've seen the dashboards and things like that. So we've got a kind of apparatus in place that all hinges on one thing, which is the belief of most people that clinical trials tell you what a drug or a vaccine does. It tells you that they work and that they're safe. Just before I go into this, I want to just mention, I was at Macbeth last night, which of course, this is the opera, and it's got a Banquo's ghost scene where Banquo turns up. But here's Banquo turning up, actually. And I don't know what anyone's going to make of this, but this is an article saying that our respiratory vaccines for either coronavirus, influenza viruses, or RSV viruses just don't work very well. And this is recent, this is this year, this article. And who's among the authors? Well, Anthony Fauci. This is the same Anthony Fauci saying, you know, our vaccines for these respiratory disorders don't work all that well. But let me take you to the main point in the talk, which is in 1962, we sidelined the judgment of a woman about what was safe. Her view was a drug that causes peripheral neuropathy is not a safe sleeping pill. Shouldn't be used, particularly during pregnancy and where, you know, you'd expect it could cause problems. Like the SSRIs, they cause peripheral neuropathy and birth defects. So 2 years before the crisis blew up and the FDA Act was changed, Louis Lasagna, whom you see there, ran a placebo-controlled trial on thalidomide, which missed the fact that it causes agitation, makes people suicidal, causes sexual dysfunction, causes peripheral neuropathy, and causes birth defects. So this was put in place. I mean, out of this, the idea of randomized controlled trials show that a drug like thalidomide works as a sleeping pill. That was put in place into the regulations. And the problem we've got is, once you start selling the idea that a drug works, maybe there is, maybe some people are worried, but the idea that it works trumps everything, particularly if you add into it the company approaches, which is, well, you know, we've told you to look away from the elephant in the room and just look over here at whether this drug works or not. And if at the end of the day you write an article saying this drug works and don't mention the elephant in the room, we're going to say to everybody, well, there were no adverse events on our drug at all. And that's essentially the world we've moved into, when in terms of pregnancy of all things, the one thing that a mother will normally be most concerned about is the safety of what she's taking, not for herself, but for her infant. Randomized controlled trials are simply a useless mechanism for working out, are drugs worth taking during pregnancy? If you don't believe me on this, I mean, you may want more detail, it's a whole other lecture to go into, then it's on my blog. You've got this lecture, which you see here. You can go into it, and there's 2 recordings of it, either of which you can look at, making the point that it's not the case that RCTs offer us gold standard evidence about what drugs do. RCTs are the gold standard way to hide adverse events, and RCTs are the standard through which industry makes gold. So that brings me back to this book here and the chapter. Now, you see the abstract there, and you see paragraph 2 is small, and paragraph 1 is small. Paragraph 2 is a bit bigger, so you can read it. And we've entered a world where we think RCTs give us objectivity. And Dee and I thought this was wrong, that, you know, what you need is a pregnancy registry where in certain areas you get every woman to record every pill she's taken, over the counter, whatever, during the course of the pregnancy. And we look at the outcomes in terms of the health of the children, physical health, mental health, this, that, and the other. And we get a huge amount of data which women can look at and try and work out, well, what risks am I happy to take? You know, what kind of conditions do I have? What are the risks of the treatment, et cetera, et cetera. Now, you'll say to me, this is uncontrolled. Yep, sure, it's uncontrolled. That it's going to be very hard to interpret. Yep, sure it is. But my point is that probably the most responsible and judicious people on this earth are women who are pregnant, are thinking about getting pregnant. They are going to weigh the risks, they're going to consult colleagues, they're going to generally look at things and make a balanced judgment, a better judgment probably than almost anyone else would. I believe in women. I have much less faith in RCTs. Thank you.